From humble beginnings and an early life marked by hardship, this legendary Gurkha would overcome incredible odds to save his comrades' lives during a fierce jungle fight. In doing so, he would receive Britain's highest award for gallantry, the Victoria Cross. In later years, he would be a tireless campaigner for veterans' rights and charitable causes. This is the extraordinary story of Rambahadur Limbu. Rambahadur Limbu. Bahadur is a Hindi word meaning warrior or great or brave man. As we shall find out, it was an auspicious and highly appropriate name for Limbu. Limbu was born on the 8th of July 1939 in the small village of Chiangtapu in Limbawan in the east of Nepal, near the Indian border. Historically, eastern Nepal is home to two main warrior tribes, the Rais and the Limbus. Within each tribe there are many clans, each with a different homeland and many complex differences. Along with other parts of Nepal, this was traditionally an area that the British Army recruited from. Living in a harsh, mountainous and unforgiving country, Gurkha people are known for being resilient, stoic and tough. However, anyone that's come across Gurkhas, or Nepalese people for that matter, will be struck by their impeccable manners, cheerfulness and hospitality. Sometimes I find it hard to juxtapose these kind and gentle chaps with their reputation as some of the world's most fearsome fighters. An instructor once told me, Gurkhas, short happy fellas with big knives, just don't make them angry. And I think that just sums it up right. Born into an agricultural family, Limbu's father had served in the Gurkhas in World War II and passed away when Limbu was 8 years old. However, his father's military stories would leave an impression on the young boy, who would later dream of following in his father's footsteps and also serving in the Gurkhas. His childhood was a hard one, losing many siblings in addition to his father. Reportedly, of 10 brothers and sisters, only himself and 2 others would survive into adulthood. Restless and not enamoured with farming, at the age of 17, he and a friend attempted to join the Gurkhas. Although he didn't succeed in his first attempt, showing the determination that would be his trademark, after a period of travel he tried again for selection, and in November 1957 officially joined the 10th Princess Mary's Own Gurkha Rifles, known as 10GR. Gurkha selection is notoriously difficult, with only around 2% of candidates being accepted. Perhaps the most notorious and well-known selection test within this process is the Doku Run. This is a 2-mile run up a steep hill carrying a basket of rocks weighing 35 kilos. Nowadays, only around 320 applicants or so each year are accepted out of a pool of 20,000. For anyone interested in the Gurkhas' history, it's really worth visiting the Gurkha Museum in Winchester, Hampshire in southern England if you can. But here's a quick summary. Britain's relationship of recruiting Gurkhas stemmed from the Anglo-Nepali War of 1814-16, when they proved, like the Sikhs and Pathans a few decades later, a tough enemy to beat for the British, and a mutual admiration and respect was born between both sides. 10 regiments of Gurkhas were eventually raised by the British. Over the next 150 years or so, the Gurkhas would build up an outstanding reputation for bravery and loyalty in numerous wars. After Indian independence in 1947, India inherited 6 Gurkha regiments and Britain kept 4. One of the 4 was 10GR. In early 1958, Limbu began his training at Sangai Patani in Malaya, and after 10 months was allocated to the 2nd Battalion 10GR in October 1958. The 10th Gurkhas were involved in the Malayan emergency from the beginning, arriving in the region in 1950. Like the Aussies, the Gurkhas were excellent jungle fighters and formed the backbone of the British presence in Malaya in the form of the 48th Gurkha Brigade and later the 17th Gurkha Division, which oversaw all British and Gurkha troops in Malaya during the emergency. 10GR remained involved until the official conclusion of the emergency in 1960. The regiment lost 75 men during the conflict. By the time Limbu reached his battalion in late 1958, the conflict was nearly over and winding down. Although Limbu was keen for action, there were few opportunities. In 1962, the battalion was then deployed to Hong Kong. Gurkha regimental culture is very conservative. Public drunkenness is frowned upon. A loss of temper, bad language, or dishonesty are not tolerated. Of course, the biggest dishonour is cowardice. The Gurkha motto is better to die than be a coward. After 2 years of service, Limbu returned to his village on long leave and got married. Due to his relatively junior rank at the time, he was not allocated a position in the battalion married quarters, so had to almost immediately leave behind his wife after their marriage, only becoming aware of the birth of his son many months later. Showing leadership potential, in 1963 he was promoted to Lance Corporal. In 1964 his wife and young son were able to join him. However, soon after he had to leave them in battalion accommodation. The 2nd Battalion were being deployed to Sarawak, Borneo. By November 1965, Limbu was stationed in the Bau district of Sarawak, with his company seeing much action. The Borneo Confrontation, also known as the Konfrontasi, was an armed conflict between Indonesia and the newly formed Federation of Malaysia, lasting from 1963 until 1966. The term Konfrontasi was carefully crafted by the Sukarno government to avoid actually declaring war and thus risking wider confrontation with Britain and the Commonwealth. The conflict arose from Indonesia's opposition to the creation of Malaysia, which combined the Federation of Malaya, Singapore and the British territories of North Borneo and Sarawak. Indonesian President Sukarno viewed this as a continuation of British colonial influence in Southeast Asia, which ruined his vision of creating a united Malay-speaking Greater Indonesia. The Indonesian government broke off diplomatic relations with Malaysia and announced the Gangyang Malaysia or Crush Malaysia campaign. In April 1963, the confrontation began with low-level cross-border raids by Indonesian volunteers into Malaysian Borneo. Sukarno, a Marxist nationalist, was supported in this endeavour by the Indonesian Communist Party, who aided the scheme by contributing fighters. Those and other forces would be termed volunteers. These incursions were aimed at destabilising the region and inciting local support for Sukarno's wider vision. The volunteers spread propaganda material amongst the local population and conducted sabotage operations. By 1964, regular Indonesian troops were becoming involved. At this point, Britain still maintained large military bases in Singapore and Hong Kong. British and Gurkha troops were sent to Borneo together with elements from the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force. They were later joined by Malaysian, Australian and New Zealand forces. The British-led force was initially commanded by Major General Walter Walker, who previously served with the Gurkhas. The headquarters was set up on Nabon Island, where there was an airfield for operations. Gurkha units would operate in Borneo on 6-month rotations, followed by periods of garrison duty and retraining in either Hong Kong, Singapore or Western Malaysia. One battalion would also be based in nearby Brunei. Tensions between the countries escalated even further in September 1963, when a mob of 10,000 Indonesian protesters torched the British embassy in Jakarta. British strategy was to dominate the border area with Indonesia. This was easier said than done, however, as it was 1,000 miles long and mostly dense, impenetrable jungle. Tactics were to use forward position surveillance or observation posts to monitor for incursions. In support would be troops housed in bases that would rapidly deploy to interdict any enemy force detected crossing the border. In the harsh terrain, these troops were deployed by foot, boat or helicopter as a quick reaction force. The fighting primarily took place in the dense jungles of Borneo, where small-scale skirmishes and guerrilla warfare were common. British and Commonwealth forces implemented further initiatives such as proactive jungle patrols, intelligence gathering and winning the hearts and minds of the local population to counter Indonesian incursions and propaganda. The conflict also saw the involvement of local forces, such as the Border Scouts, who played a crucial role in defending the frontier. Despite the intensity of the clashes, the conflict remained relatively contained and did not escalate into full-scale war. During the first stage of the conflict, Indonesians were able to attack where and when they chose, and even carried out raids on western Malaysia with seaborne and parachute forces. A bombing campaign also targeted Singapore. These raids on western Malaysia so alarmed the British that the government agreed to limited attacks on Indonesian troops and military bases inside Indonesian Borneo, known as Kalimantan, although much of this would be classified at the time to prevent any further escalation. Gurkha battalions would take part both in the defensive operations and in the cross-border raids, often calling in artillery and air support. In time, these raids would take away the initiative from the Indonesians and were a turning point in the war. During one such operation along the border area in Sirakin Bau, about 5 kilometres into then Indonesian territory, on the 21st of November 1965, is where Lance Corporal Limbu found himself patrolling in the jungle with his company. During the patrol, his company discovered a strong enemy force, around 30 strong, entrenched on top of a sheer-sided hill in the jungle. As part of an advance party of 16 troops, Limbu went forward to assault the enemy position with 2 men. At a range of 10 yards, they were detected by a sentry, who fired on the Gurkhas. Limbu then rushed forward and killed the sentry with a grenade. At that point, his 2 comrades were shot and wounded by the other Indonesians who had been alerted and were pouring heavy automatic weapons fire at the Gurkhas. With total disregard for his own safety under fire, Limbu made 3 separate attempts to drag his wounded comrades to safety, and then to retrieve a light machine gun dropped when his comrade was shot. I shall read this extract from his citation. He, Limbu, saw both men of his own group seriously wounded. Knowing that their only hope of survival was immediate first aid, and that evacuation from the very exposed position, so close to the enemy, was vital, he immediately commenced the first of his 3 supremely gallant attempts to rescue his comrades. Using what little cover he could find, he crawled forward, in full view of at least 2 enemy machine gun posts, who concentrated their fire on him, and which, at this stage of the battle, could not be effectively subdued by the rest of his platoon. For 3 full minutes, he continued to move forward, but when almost able to touch the nearest casualty, he was driven back by the accurate and intense weight of fire covering his line of approach. After a pause, he again started to crawl forward, but he soon realised that only speed would give him the cover which the ground could not. Rushing forward, he hurled himself on the ground beside one of the wounded, and calling for support from 2 light machine guns which had now come up to his right in support, he picked up the man and carried him safely out of the line of fire. What guts that must have taken to keep going back to fetch your mate, even when you've been driven back by heavy fire. After that, he then went on to go and rescue his second oppo. The citation continues. Without hesitation, he immediately returned to the top of the hill, determined to complete his self-imposed task of saving those for whom he felt personally responsible. It was now clear from the increased rate of fire being concentrated on the approaches to and in the immediate vicinity of the remaining casualty, the enemy were doing all they could to prevent any further attempts at rescue. However, despite this, Lance Corporal Limbu again moved out into the open for his final effort. In a series of short forward rushes, and once again being pinned down for some minutes by the intense and accurate automatic fire which could be seen striking the ground all around him, he eventually reached the wounded man. Picking him up and unable to seek cover, he carried him back as fast as he could through a hail of enemy bullets. It had taken 20 minutes to complete this gallant action, and the events leading up to it. For all but a few seconds of this, the young non-commissioned officer had been moving alone in full view of the enemy and under continuous aimed fire of their automatic weapons. 20 minutes! That he was able to achieve what he did against such overwhelming odds without being hit is miraculous. His outstanding personal bravery, selfless conduct, complete contempt of the enemy, and determination to save the lives of the men of his fire group set an incomparable example and inspired all who saw him. And if that wasn't enough, incredibly, he then went out to retrieve a Bren gun which had been dropped by his wounded comrade. Once Limbu retrieved the weapon, he then focused on the enemy trench, machine gunning several of the enemy and supporting the rest of the company on a prolonged assault on the enemy position, which lasted an hour. The citation describes the battle as fought at point-blank range and with the utmost ferocity by both sides. The engagement in total cost the enemy at least 24 dead, Limbu accounting for several of those. The cost to the Gurkhas was 3 killed and 2 wounded. He displayed heroism, self-sacrifice and devotion to duty and to his men of the very highest order. His actions on this day reached a zenith of determined, premeditated valour which must count amongst the most notable on record and is deserving of the greatest admiration and the highest praise. The confrontation ended in 1966, following the fall of Sukarno's regime and the rise of Suharto in Indonesia. A peace agreement was reached and Indonesia formally recognised the formation of Malaysia. The conflict highlighted the geopolitical tensions of the Cold War era in Southeast Asia, as Indonesia received indirect support from the Soviet Union and China, whilst Malaysia, during the conflict, was backed by Western powers. The resolution of the confrontation marked a significant step towards stability in the region. During the campaign, a total of 259 Commonwealth troops were killed or wounded. The Gurkhas would bear a high proportion of that, at 149. The Australians, who had contributed a battalion, at times either 3 or 4 RAR, lost 23 killed. Tragically, his return to Maori quarters in early 1966 was marred by the discovery that his wife was gravely ill, and she passed away soon after, leaving him a widower with 2 young sons, one of them a baby. Deeply affected by this blow, Limbu came close to leaving the army, but whilst deliberating, he was made aware of his having received the Victoria Cross for his actions, and had been invited to Buckingham Palace to be invested with his award in person by Queen Elizabeth II. The medal was presented by the Queen in a ceremony at Buckingham Palace in 1966. Speaking of the ceremony, Limbu stated, "She told me, 'This is great work you have done. I am very happy with you.' It was a shame that my English was not good, as I would have liked to have talked to her more." Limbu would meet Queen Elizabeth again decades later in Nepal. Limbu's 5-year-old son was flown to England at the request of the Queen for his father's investiture. Sadly, not long after, Limbu's original Victoria Cross was stolen along with his other possessions while he was asleep during a train journey in India to his native Nepal whilst on leave in 1967. It has never been found, but he was issued with a replacement. Limbu remarried and, showing further aptitude, steadily progressed through the ranks during the 1970s and 80s, reaching the rank of captain as a Queen's Gurkha officer, and was appointed member of the Royal Victorian Order in 1985 for his service as an official Queen's Gurkha orderly officer. A tradition going back to the Raj, 2 are nominated each year to assist the monarch with various ceremonies in the royal household. To be selected as a Queen's Gurkha officer is a great honour, and only the highest standards are looked for in the officers that are selected for the position. I think that's a testament to Limbu's character. After over 28 years' service, Limbu then retired from active service in the British Army in 1985. He then served until 1992 with the Gurkha Reserve Unit of the Sultan of Brunei, before retiring to the city of Damak in Nepal. However, even in retirement, Limbu did not rest. He spent his time tirelessly conducting social and charitable work for ex-servicemen and their families. Working with organisations like the Gurkha Welfare Trust, he significantly contributed to good causes, such as building roads, a school, and even a temple in his local community. Aged in his 70s, Limbu even travelled to Westminster in London to speak during a Gurkha welfare inquiry into concerns over pension rights, adult dependence, compensation, equal treatment for Gurkha widows, and medical treatment for veterans in Nepal. Throughout that time also, he continued to attend military and veteran events as a VC recipient. In doing so, he inspired generations of younger Gurkha and British soldiers. Apparently, in his spare time, Limbu loved to watch kung fu movies and was a fan of both Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee. I'm sure, looking back to those days in November 1965, to his oppos, he was their superstar. Much beloved by his family and community, and remembered as a caring, playful and loving man. Sadly, in April 2023, aged 83, Limbu passed away of heart and kidney failure. He was one of 13 Gurkha Victoria Cross recipients. In summary, for Rambahadur Limbu's medals, we have Victoria Cross, member of the Royal Victorian Order, General Service Medal 1918 with Malaya clasp, a GSM or General Service Medal 1962 with Borneo and Malaya Peninsula clasp, Queen Elizabeth Jubilee Medals 1977, 2002, 2012 and 2022. Thanks to the viewer that pointed out a Victoria Cross recipient will receive a Royal Medal throughout the course of their life. So this could be Coronation or Jubilee medals. A Regular Army Long Service and Good Conduct Medal. A Brunei Gurkha Reserve Unit Service Medal. And finally, a Pingat Jasa Malaysia Medal. The Gurkha Brigade Association stated, Limbu has been a figurehead and exemplar of Gurkha bravery for generations of Gurkha recruits and soldiers. Many years later, when asked about his action, Limbu stated, I didn't think I was going to be shot. All I cared about was rescuing my friends. This seems to be a constant theme for many of the real-life heroes that we've covered so far. Thanks for watching. I hope you found some value from this, and I'll see you in the next one.